My name is Simon Constam. I'm from Toronto. I've been living in Toronto for a number of years now. And in January, my first book of poetry was published at the age of 32. I started writing when I was quite young, when I was in my early teens. But I gave it up because of a very unfortunate circumstance. I shouldn't have given it up, but I did. Started writing again when I was 57. So it's been about 15 years now, and it's taken me about that long to write this book. It's a book that's very dear to me because it looks at some issues and some problems specifically in the religious sphere that I think people oftentimes consider themselves. And it's a book of Jewish poetry, ostensibly, but it is not exclusively pertinent to Jewish people. I've had a number of people read it, including priests and ministers, who've really gotten a lot out of it. So I feel very comfortable in suggesting you take a look at it, and I think when you hear a few of the poems, you'll get an idea of the sorts of ways in which I look at things. Well, I write every day, and I write orally, so I compose aloud. To me, that's very important, and I try wherever I can to read, to be a featured reader, or even to read an open mic, so I do that quite a bit. And the main purpose of it is to get a sense of what the poems mean when I hear them aloud. I believe that poetry should be both heard and seen on the written page. These poems were, I suppose, written for the page, but really I think that they transfer pretty well to an oral reading. The process otherwise is fairly straightforward. I didn't start out to write this book. What I've found over the years is that a number of things that I write fall into categories. So, for example, I'm working on a set of poems about relationships between husband and wife and boyfriend and girlfriend and so on. And they just seem to come together, and so that's how they gather under a single title. And that's what happened with this. Some of these poems were actually in earlier collections that I sent off to publishers, which were not published. And then I suddenly realized that they belonged in the same volume, and so that's how this came about. The book is titled Brought Down, and the title actually has a specific reference, a specific religious reference, and that is that in the Jewish tradition we talk about things being brought down from heaven or brought down from God, ideas, that sort of thing. And that to me is a pretty pregnant phrase. It speaks to mankind's free will. It speaks to God's presence in the world. I'm very much a believer in God, even though in this book I'm quite often angry with God. That's something that I feel on a regular basis. Some of these poems are directed to God. I'm speaking directly to God, and some are commentaries that are really out of my own mind, and in many cases out of the Jewish tradition. So I don't have a really specific writing methodology. I do write every single day. I don't set aside a specific time. I just try to get at it every day, and I always find a few minutes or a couple of hours to do that. It's hard to separate the reading from the writing. I want to read more and more. I find every time I sit down, what I really want to do is to write and not just to read, but I think it's important to read, and I read quite widely. I have an enormous selection of poetry books, about 1,200 poetry books. I've actually been collecting those since I was 14 or 15 years old. So I'm surrounded by the poetry books, and I'm really surrounded by poetry. It means an awful lot to me. My father was a real lover of poetry. He loved Goethe and Heine, two German poets he was very fond of. And my great uncle was a translator of Yiddish poetry. So I come to it quite naturally. And yeah, so these poems I think are quite unlike anything that you might have seen before. And you'll get a sense of that when I read a few of these. I go into it with really no holds barred. I'm not concerned about upsetting anybody. I'm not concerned about, taking God to task. There are one or two poems in this book where I ask myself, do I really want to say some of these things publicly? And I ultimately concluded that I do. And I suppose in a sense I ask forgiveness of God in advance. Whether he gave it to me or not, I don't know. But I don't seem to have suffered any terrible consequence to this point anyway, so we'll see about that. Yeah. Well, there's an aphorism that I feel very strongly about, and I think that it's a great truth, and that is that writing is revising. I think that one has to really reject the idea that whatever you put down on the page today is going to be the finished poem. I really think it's important to write again and again, and to look at poems a day later, a week later, a month later. I have a number of poems that are in process for years at a time. The other day I read a poem from the book at a workshop that I attended, and I was asked, well, it's in the book already, you know, it's finished, so why are you concerned about getting some criticism? And I said, the criticism is important to me. I'm quite happy to change a poem, whether it's been published or not. It doesn't really make any difference to me. I think because, you know, the striving is to write something that's good, and potentially one day to write something that's great. And to me, there isn't a place in the road, a signpost that says you're done. I think you can always improve. And that might be something as simple as a comma. It might be as simple as putting one word in place of another. It might be adjusting the rhyme scheme, whatever it happens to be. But I do think that poems are really not finished. I mean, in a sense, they're a way of seeing, they're a way of looking at the world, and so you constantly have to adjust to that idea that you're constantly looking at the world in a different way. There are some poems that I can read now that I read 50 years ago, and they still are very meaningful to me, and some that I read 20 years ago that mean absolutely nothing to me now. So I'm striving to write something that's going to last, that's going to be very good, and oftentimes I have to revise a lot over a period of time. I found myself over years writing little notes and pieces and aphorisms and so on, just beside my writing, just as I was doing this, sections of poems that didn't work out, all kinds of things like that. And about 3.5 years ago, it occurred to me that I had a lot of aphorisms, and that it would be worth putting some of these aphorisms up. And so I started on Instagram and also to an email subscriber base, and I've been doing it now every single day. I put up an original aphorism every single day. I used to, until 3 or 4 months ago, every single one was brand new. But I've had some trouble keeping up, so now I go back and some of the things that I published 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, I'll put those up again. And they've garnered a really good interactive audience. People like them, sometimes they dislike them, sometimes they disagree with them, but I found it to be a very interesting form. I do consider it to be a form of poetry. I don't think that it's akin to haiku or tanka, Japanese forms, but it is akin to miniature forms of poetry, and I think that it's possible in the length of a single line or a couple of lines to make something that people will really think about. What defines poetry for me is an intense moment. If you can read a poem and feel it intensely, that to me is the best you can hope for, and it's a magnificent thing to hope for if it means something to people, you know, even though it's very short. Which does not mean, by the way, that I don't like long poetry. I like long poetry as well, but I think it's much harder to write a long poem than it is to write a short poem. Because inspiration doesn't usually come in the form of a novel, you know. And certainly if God's going to give you something, he's not going to say, here are 400 pages of a good story. You know, you really have to work hard at that. And I think you have to work just as hard at poetry as you do at novel writing, for example. This was written 3 years ago or 4 years ago. My concern about people all over the world being able to achieve what they want to achieve and what they should be able to achieve in the world. Refugee. Her darkness in the darkness, and that she is a nihilist, surprises me. All refugees think like that, she says. Who put you here? Who put me there? You'd expect her to be grateful, but when she sees that in your face, she simply asks, to whom? For what? She says, all refugees think like that. Who put me there? Who put you here? It's a poem that's addressed to God, and it's called Almighty. You're a Torah scroll. You're a mountain rock. You're a page filled with ancient talk. You're 2 brilliant blue sapphire blocks. You're a temple wall, an empty ark. You're masquerading as the dark. You're a writer gone mad, a writer gone to ground, a writer on the lam. You don't want to be found. You're a palimpsest, an all too fallible psychotherapist. You're a brazen monologist, a single, lonely witness to the event. We won't stop looking for you, wherever you went. You will be who you will be. You're a blue screen, you're the ocean depths. In the blue of the midday sun, your throne is all that's left of you. See it from here. You never talk back. You're a divine hack. You should be better than that. So that gives you a bit of an idea of perhaps the courage that I think that it takes to write poetry. You know, I didn't write poetry for a long time because I was worried about revealing things which were given to me as secrets, as confidences, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to harm anybody close to me. Eventually I realized I could get around that, but there's a degree to which you can't write poetry without being self-revelatory. You know, it's simply going to come. And I believe that's true for every poet, even those poets who are completely attuned to nature, for example, who are speaking about the beauty that they see. I think that there's a certain amount of self-revelation there. Yeah. This poem is called Text. Rabbi Aharon Zalman Lieb brought down that a wife should be allowed to be present in a room unaccompanied with a man not her husband if the general society deems the man to be worthy of such trust. So doctors she may be with, lawyers she may be with, policemen investigating a crime she may be with, delivery men she may not. She must transact the exchange of money for parcel at her open front door. The issue of plumbers and repairmen, on the other hand, is a difficult one. Women should be wary. Passers-by may well interpret incorrectly. This is not to say that exceptions are not possible for the representatives of well-known companies, but all agree that cousins, brothers-in-law, and the friends of husbands are not permissible. So he ruled. Now it is true that some have disputed Reb Lieb's pronouncements. The philosopher Eliezer Greenshaft, scion of a great rabbinical house, himself a God-fearing man, looked up into the sky within which the world floats, and saw as perfectly legible as if on paper God's intention. Eliezer seated himself at the great oak table his family had owned for more than 200 years, and brought down onto the page the idea that women should be free of all rules and restrictions such as Reb Lieb had promulgated. Some say we do not think our own thoughts, nor dream our own dreams, that there is a heavenly text from which we draw the days of our lives, and though we act upon each other, we cannot be assured that what we think is causing good is not rather deeply wounding. We know that holiness lies in every place we look. Therefore, if it is true that our understanding is incomplete, regardless, our behavior never seems to be uncertain. And if our belief is too unflinching, we may never even need to understand the world which is. How hard it is to sit at a desk observing both text and city streets. Often the two do not reconcile to anyone's satisfaction. Why would God respect two views inimical to each other? And is there anywhere a trial which will settle the matter? O Holy One, must we resolve ourselves in you? The distance is too great, and you are so different from us. We must settle this in ourselves. Now is when you should stand back, not allow yourself to be invoked or quoted. So the next poem I'm going to read is entitled More Light. This is the wisdom I inferred from the passing by of God. Everything is clear. There may be a door. Death must be a door. And there must be another door. But if it is your mind, it lies. If it says that what lies in store for the devoted, the deeply humble, the learned, or the clever. Study. Study more. Subject yourself like Timothy Leary, like John Lilly, like Jonas Salk. Don't study beauty. Don't be enamored of beauty. Study what you cannot see. what you came here for," a voice said, speaking to me. And the next poem is entitled Amenable. This is a difficult poem for me, and I think you'll see why. My mother was in hiding during the Holocaust. She was Dutch. For 3.5 years she was in hiding. She was born in 1907, so in 1942, when the Germans invaded Holland, she was already 35 years old, and she was responsible for taking care of her youngest sister, who was just a young teenager at the time. And she was pushed from pillar to post, from one hiding place to another hiding place. And this is not specifically about her, nor is it specifically about my grandmother, although it's framed that way. But it really has more to do with my sense of how people come out of these kinds of events. Amenable. I'm amenable to not being governed by my history. Why test others with what my people have suffered? I have little patience for those who incessantly remember their suffering bona fides, hundreds of years of their injurious histories. Every night there they are, scrounging around in the halls of the forgotten. A young woman told me that the racism her people suffered will have to be expiated throughout the entire universe one day. When I think of my grandmother, once a tempestuous young communist in the Nalabotskaya forest, just now coming to the end of her life, which features blindness and crippling arthritis in both her hands, I probably shouldn't talk of it. She confided to me that she murdered several men, and somehow came around finally to almost regretting it. She had locked it away for so long, the whole business of fighting back. She never spoke of it, even ever to her husband. But she assumed, because of my generation, that I'd understand her remorse. But she also told me that it didn't matter what I thought. It was finally enough. Simon Wiesenthal had spent years at it, but being an old Jew now, she wanted to get past that stuff. Being an old Nazi is its own revenge, she said. And for her, why bother to do anything now but live? You can't murder and expect to be absolved, she told me. But then she would forget what she told me and tell it to me all over again. The tempest of the clock has defeated everything. She does also occasionally acknowledge how sometimes it is better to murder than to run. I guess I'm amenable to that. I think I understand that my grandmother was thinking not just of herself. I love her so much. And I'm amenable now if the people themselves were involved, and to people remembering, even if I suppose it was their grandmother or relatives you've never known, really anyone, I suppose. I'm amenable to remembering those who were killed, those who did wrong, those who cowered in the face of hatred, those who fought back, those who had to do the killing. That poem is particularly meaningful to me because, sometimes we tire of hearing people's histories and, what people went through for generations and decades and so on and so forth. And I think it's really important that we remember, that we allow them to remember publicly. And that poem was written in part for that purpose.